Yeah, first, I didn't read Arnold Bertrand's article about Mao. It was very interesting. So thank you for letting me know.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I,
yeah,
I just want to say a little bit about there's a lot of a confusion about the Cultural Revolution, I think. Now, Cultural
yes,
Revolution is it was a big mistake from Mao's perspective. But
yes,
over the years, I think I kind of understand why he did that. The West tend to portray this, he's just crazy and he just
yeah,
want to throw all the intellectuals into prison,
mm,
create all these chaos and hurting
mm,
people. I don't think that's how he wanted. I think at the time people needs to understand that he was facing a lot of challenges. That was
yeah,
the time both the Soviet and the US
that's right.
was against China. And the
Mm,
Nationalist Party, the Chiang Kai-shek, he left a lot of spies, covert operations, lots of things that is very unsettled, and they
yeah,
even conducted assassinations to
yeah,
high-level Chinese officials, and some of which were successful.
yeah,
They tried to assassinate Zhou Enlai, for example. Now they failed with that, but nonetheless, there were other people who were actually
yeah.
hurt or even being killed. So it is a very challenging time for him. So I think he got paranoid for that because there's so many challenges, there's so many danger everywhere.
Yes.
And so for him, it is important to have a clean kind of a operation within China to make sure that
Mm,
it's a safe environment. But
yes.
eventually, I think he lost control and it became chaotic. I think that's what happened.
He did lose control, and I was told by long ago by a Western journalist, a very left wing Western
Uh-huh.
journalist, who was there in Tiananmen Square
Mhm.
at one of the big rallies and was very close to Mao, that he got the sense that Mao was absolutely deeply, deeply upset by
Mhm.
the way in which things were getting out of control.
Yeah.
There's a few things I would say about this, which is
Mhm.
briefly a number of points. Firstly, the idea of Mao Zedong being an anti-intellectual is preposterous, given that Mao was
Mhm.
an intellectual himself to his absolute fingertips,
Mhm.
as you know much better than me. He was a poet. He
Mhm.
was a superb calligrapher. Even I
Yeah.
could see
Yeah.
how exceptional his calligraphy is. He was a man who knew Chinese history incredibly well. I mean, the idea that this man is somehow antagonistic to literature and culture and antagonistic to China's culture is absurd. And I know that there is a lot of criticism of him, and I know also that there's a lot of criticism of what's his name, Kang She or whatever his name
Uh-huh.
was, who was also an important figure then, and maybe justified in that case. But Kang She, for what it is worth, was also a very, very accomplished calligrapher.
Mhm.
And in the London art market, items of Kang's calligraphy fetch tens upon tens of thousands of pounds. So
Oh.
these people were not anti-intellectuals,
Mhm.
not by any conceivable
Mhm.
stretch of the imagination. I mean, that is an absurd thing. The second is that obviously there was immense pressure on China
Mhm.
and on Mao himself. And there's one thing which I think many people in China themselves don't know, but which is talked about in Russia quite a lot, which is that after the overthrow of Nikita Khrushchev,
Mhm.
Zhou Enlai came to Moscow, and there was expectations, there was hopes that this would lead to an improvement in relations
Mhm.
between the Soviet Union and China. And over the course of that meeting, the Soviet defense minister, who was a man called Marshal Malinovsky, came up to Zhou Enlai and said to him, and Zhou Enlai assumed that Malinovsky was talking on behalf of the entire Soviet leadership. He said, look, we've just overthrown
Mhm.
our own idiot who was Khrushchev.
Mhm.
Why don't you do the same thing to Mao? And Zhou Enlai said, under no
Mhm.
circumstances. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think that's what I'm about, if you think that this is what China's about, you have misunderstood us completely.
Mhm.
Anyway, Zhou Enlai reported this to Mao. Mao was, of course, extremely angry and very alarmed. He then messaged Moscow and he said, "What is this?" And was expecting that the Soviet leadership would repudiate Malinovsky or even sack him.
Mhm.
And they didn't.
Yeah.
So after that, Mao completely understandably assumed that they really were out to get him,
Mhm.
which probably many of them were. We also now know, by the way, that there was a faction within the Soviet leadership at that time, led by a man called Alexander Shelepin, who wanted to improve relations with China. He was a committed communist
Mhm.
and he wanted to reunite the communist movement. And he was secretary to the Central Committee, and he was in conflict with Brezhnev, who was
Mhm.
the Soviet leader at this time. And of course, he lost the power struggle, the internal power struggle in Moscow. But quite possibly, relations with China were affected by this internal power struggle. This has been talked a lot about in Moscow because the Russians, just to say this, blame themselves for the failure of the relationship with China in the 60s. I mean, it is well understood in Moscow today that they made a whole succession of catastrophic errors and that they treated China and Mao himself with extreme disrespect. And there is a very widespread view in Russia today that the single reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was precisely because of the split in the communist movement and the fact that the Soviet Union found itself in the 70s pitted against both China and the United States simultaneously, and this broke its resources.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say all of that because I
Mhm.
think it's worthwhile for people in China, those people who follow our programs, to be
Mhm.
aware of all of these things. And one of the things I would follow up from that and say is that precisely because there is a widespread opinion in Moscow that, as I said, ruining the relations with China was a catastrophic mistake for Russia, for the Soviet Union. There is a widespread consensus that that is a mistake that must never be made again. So that when people in China worry that the Russians might one day be tempted back into closer relations with the United States. Well, that is not what most people, including most important people in Russia, think today.
Yeah. It's just in general. I mean, all these things are
Mm,
not as simple as the
no,
West,
no,
right?
no,
The Western media portrays it. When
no,
they portray somebody good, then it's good. Somebody evil, then
no.
it's evil. There's
Yes,
nothing in between. But humans are
yes,
complex and many times
yes.
contradictory, right? So,
Absolutely,
so
absolutely. Anyway, did you see my comment on the
yes,
thread?
yes, that was very interesting. Yes, yeah,
Because I should tell you, I'm very, very interested in watches
yeah.
altogether. So,
Mm.
and I've always been interested in Chinese
Yeah, I didn't know
watches. So,
that either, until
yes,
you talked
yeah,
about that, and then I saw your comments.
yes,
Yeah, so
yes,
great, thank you. All right. So there's lots of phone calls, right? Okay, this week. So the Xi Jinping phone call to Trump. Now, the New York Times and other U.S. media reported that it's highly unusual that he called Trump.
yeah,
But the Chinese foreign minister's spokesperson, Mao Ning, she said the U.S. took the initiative.
yeah,
So here's what I think happened. Now, if you read the readouts by the Chinese foreign minister, it didn't say anything like by invitation or per request. Normally, they would do that if it
no,
is the U.S. initiative. But I think the U.S. Trump, it seems like they always want to talk to Xi Jinping for some reason, one reason
yeah,
or another.
mm,
So it is possible that they contacted China first and saying, is it time for
yeah,
the president to talk? And normally China would be slow on responding, like, okay, let's set up a time, an agenda, and then
mm,
maybe they even,
yeah,
alert the media ahead of time before their real phone call. But this time, Xi Jinping just basically said, okay, just dial the number then. So that's, I think, what happened. So Xi Jinping
Yes.
probably did make the phone call, but it is also possible that US did ask in
Yes.
advance to do so.
I
Nonetheless,
think
nonetheless, I do think this time Xi Jinping or China is eager to talk to Trump.
Yes, I think all that is absolutely correct. And I should say something else. What you described is exactly what has happened with the last Putin Trump call,
Okay.
because the Americans told everybody that it was the Russians who initiated the call,
Mhm.
that it was Putin who called Trump. And then Lavrov said, that isn't true. It was the Americans who started the discussions. And in fact, we now have these leaks that have come out over the last couple of days. And we've discovered that one of them is a discussion between Witkoff and Ushakov, who's Putin's foreign policy aide. And talking about this future call that's going to happen between Putin and Trump.
Mhm.
It's absolutely clear that it was the Americans who first floated the
Mhm.
idea of having a call. The Americans, Witkoff then said to Ushakov, well, you've got to say this and that and the other because that's what the boss wants to hear. But it's clear that it was the Americans who were who've been pushing this thing. And I suspect something very similar happened with this call between Xi Jinping and Trump as well. That again, the Americans or somebody in the US first floated the idea, and the Chinese went along with it and picked it up. And then the Americans, just as they did with the Putin Trump call, pretended that it was the Russians who called Trump. So they're doing the same with the Chinese, that it was the Chinese who called Trump. It's very, very much part of Trump's ego
Mhm.
that he wants to be the person that people call,
Mhm.
than being the person who himself does the calling.
Mhm.
And you're absolutely right, though. It is he who wants to talk all the time to everybody.
Yeah. But it is clear this time that
Yeah.
Xi Jinping was interested, eager to talk. So that
Yes.
seems
Yes.
it
Yes.
is unusual in that sense.
Yes.
So now, of course, everybody expected that this phone call is about Taiwan.
Yeah.
Actually, it's about Japan. Commenting
Yes.
on Taiwan. But actually, based on the Chinese readout, he didn't name Japan by name.
No.
He emphasizes Taiwan issue, and he emphasized that here's something interesting. He said that
No.
Taiwan's return to China is an important component of the post-war international order. China and the United States fought side by side against the fascism and the militarism and should now work together to safeguard the achievements of the victory in World War II. So he bring it into a different level, it seems to me, not just
No.
limited to Taiwan issue, but this is the post-war order that you and we need to both safeguard. That's interesting, isn't it?
I find it most interesting. I find it the most interesting part of the whole conversation. And I'm not sure how it's read in China,
Hmm.
but the way I would see it, and maybe I'm, drawing perhaps too much on the Russian way of seeing things here, because
Hmm.
remember, I know much more about Russia than I do about China. But to me, it looks like Xi Jinping basically telling Trump, look, this country, Japan, which you consider to be your ally, I mean, they were the people we fought against together. They were the people who were involved in fascism and militarism and all of these things. And they are now going back to that. They're
Hmm.
drifting back into those kind of sentiments and positions. And this is upsetting. It's calling into doubt our victory, our joint victory, which we fought for and struggled so hard together to achieve. So, given that these terrible ideas and these forces are getting strong in Japan again,
Hmm.
surely we have more commonality with each other than you do with Japan.
Hmm.
Now, that's how I would read it. But as I said, that's how the Russians would probably read comments like this. In China, I accept it might be a bit different. whatever way it was, I can tell you one thing: I doubt very much that Trump himself would have understood any hidden message there. And I don't know whether you saw his Truth Social post, but it was ridiculous. It was all about agriculture,
Soybeans.
soybeans, and all that kind of thing. I mean, it was just. I mean, it went completely over his head. Though the reports in the media do say that he did, in fact, call the Japanese Prime Minister and tell her to calm down and stop talking in quite such inflammatory way from this moment. But I mean, I doubt that he would have understood the strength of the message that Xi Jinping was trying to give.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's what Xi Jinping trying
Yeah,
to come
yeah,
across. And like you said, at least Trump understood that this is a serious matter, that it
yes,
bothers China tremendously. So it's good for him to make the call. Based on the readout from the Japanese Foreign Ministry, it doesn't sound like a very pleasant call because they didn't
yes,
mention that they talk about Taiwan at all, which we all
yes,
know that they did. So if
yes,
Trump said anything positive to support Takaichi's statement, they would have posted there, but they didn't.
yes.
So
No,
it seems
exactly.
to me that it wasn't that pleasant of a call. Um,
I'm sure that's right. I mean, I don't think the United States wants to get drawn into this
mhm,
conflict. I've discussed this extensively, by the way, on the Duran, and the
mhm,
point I've simply made is this: I mean, if China gets the sense that the United States is siding with Japan over this issue, in this kind of way, in effect undermining the joint victory in the Second World War, then China will start to take action. And
yeah.
one of the things it might do, and I mean, this is my own guess, but I would be surprised if this wasn't at least a possibility, is that China would say, if the US is aligning itself with a Japan that is falling back into policies of militarism and fascism, then the last thing China is going to continue to do is to supply rare earths to the United
Mm.
States to build up so that the United States can develop more weapons, which it will either sell to Japan or use in that alliance that it has with Japan. So, I mean, I think that the Americans need to understand that they are treading in on extremely dangerous territory now if they continue with this. As I said, I doubt that Trump has understood it fully, but I hope that there are other people in Washington who have.